Welcome back to the Opperman Report. I am your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and we are live here Friday night on freedomslips.com, which is a listener-sponsored radio station. So if you want to keep hearing what you're hearing, you got to visit the website, freedomslips.com, and find the donate button and make a donation because the station's in trouble. We got to make some money this month really, really fast. We're also simulcast tonight on cjmarsradio.com and Live 365 Live. And you're going to catch us again Monday night. We're rebroadcast 6 p.m. on awakeradio.us and awakeradio.uk and a couple other stations over there. And then again, Tuesday night, we're on Hazy Radio. And then Wednesday night, we're on firehorsenetwork.com. So I'm on all the time, 24 hours 7. Okay. But we got Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, an investigation of Mark Fuhrman and racism in the LAPD. And today is the anniversary of the OJ trial. About, I guess, Stephen, is it 20 years ago, 30 years ago? How long ago was it?
20 years ago. Started yesterday, 20 years ago.
Wow, time flies, huh?
Yeah, time does fly.
Well, Stephen, tell us about yourself, and we'll get into this book and all your other books as well.
Well, I'm a Denver-based nonfiction investigative journalist, nonfiction book writer. I've written 20 books. 2 of them have been New York Times bestsellers. About a dozen of them have been about high-profile criminal cases, some of the major cases of the last 20 years or so. I work with my wife, Joyce, here, and we are currently investigating a couple of cases. And that's basically the story. I've been doing this for about 30 years, and the OJ story ties in with some other things that we've done.
Oh, really? What does it tie into?
Well, to really understand my involvement in the OJ thing, I mean, you have to have some background here. In 1984, this month, June 18th, 1984, I was living in Denver. There was a talk show host here named Alan Berg. Alan Berg was quite outspoken. He was liberal in his bent, and he, annoyed a lot of people. And he would go on the air and talk very seriously about things like racism and anti-Semitism, and stirred up a number of people here. In 1984, there was a group in the Northwest called the Order. They decided to create a white power revolution against minorities, gays, feminists, anybody they deemed their enemies. And they set it in motion. And one of the people in the group was from Denver. He'd fought with Berg on the air throughout the years, and he said this should be our first target. So in June of 1984, it's 30 years ago, almost right now, they came to Denver, and they gunned down Berg in his driveway with a MAC-10 automatic pistol. My first book was about that case called Talk to Death, The Life and Murder of Alan Berg. The Oliver Stone movie Talk Radio, which came out in 1989, is partially based on that book. A lot of people have seen that movie, and some of it translates over. Anyway, I did a lot of investigating into far-right groups, racist groups, etc. And so 10 years later, almost exactly, the Simpson case started, June of 1994. We've just jumped ahead 10 years. And I sort of paid attention to it like a lot of people did, but I wasn't involved in it until August of 1984, about 7 weeks into the case. And I was contacted by somebody in L.A.'s criminal justice system whom I had become aware of during the Berg research. And that individual said to me, are you watching this case? Are you watching what's unfolding? And yeah, I was. And so he said, there are some similarities between what you were writing about with Berg and what you are going to see in this case. And at the time, it really didn't make any sense to me. I mean, it seemed rather, far-fetched for something like this to happen. And he said there are 4 pieces of information, essentially, that the defense team is not aware of in this case, 4 important pieces of information. And if you would like to get involved in it, I would share that information with you. And you could look into it on your own, see if it's valid, see if it holds up and all of that. This was a very, very, very unlikely scenario. I mean, just to let everybody out there who's listening know that. I was sitting in Denver, about 1,200 miles away from the case. and all of that. I had no intention of getting involved, but I was given these 4 pieces of information. I tried to contact the defense. I said, well, why don't I go to the prosecution if this is such important information? They said, nobody there is going to listen to you. Nobody's going to pay any attention to it. They've already convicted Simpson. The case is over in their minds, and so the only people that you would have any shot at is someone on the defense team. Robert Shapiro had an 800 number set up at that point. I left a couple of messages and didn't get anywhere. So I wrote a fax containing the 4 pieces of information, and I managed to get it into Johnny Cochran's office a few days later. At first they didn't read it. I called back and made a few insistent remarks and said, you really ought to look at this. And 15 minutes later I was on the phone with Carl Douglas, who was Johnny Cochran's second in command. And Cochran was sort of taking over the case at that time more than Shapiro. So Carl Douglas was an important person. And he said, where'd you get this information? I wouldn't tell him. I wanted to sit down with him and have a face-to-face meeting. And he said, well, I won't do that. And we haggled around a little bit. And 4 days later, that was a Thursday, on Monday, I was in the office, in Shapiro's office in Los Angeles with Carl Douglas, Bill Pavlik, who was a private investigator working for the defense, former LAPD cop, and talking about some of these things. The interesting part of it right there is that they said one piece of information was a broken piece of stick. Another piece of information was a blue plastic bag that homicide detectives carry with them. Another piece of information was that Mark Fuhrman had a relationship with Nicole Simpson that went beyond just having gone over to the Simpsons' house one time when there was a blow-up over there that most people are familiar with. And the 4th piece of information, which was by far the most important thing, was that this is complicated. So people, if they're interested in this story, they really sort of have to wade through this, because
my audience is really familiar with the Simpson case, and we actually had T.H. Johnson. We had him on for 6 hours.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're pretty good.
People who are very familiar with the Simpson case shockingly don't know most of this information.
Okay, great.
So what I was told was that the blood in this case was going to turn the critical blood pieces of evidence against O.J. Simpson were going, in fact, to be O.J. Simpson's blood. But they had not come out of his body on the night of the crime. They had come out of a vial. When you're a suspect in a homicide case, you go to the police, they take your blood, they put it in usually a purple-capped vial that contains a substance called EDTA. And I was told that that's where the critical pieces of evidence in this case came from, and you could find that out by simply testing the blood samples in this case, because EDTA is an insoluble compound. It would still be in those samples. So I went to Los Angeles. I presented this information. Carl Douglas said to me...
Can I interrupt you? Did you go to Los Angeles on your own dime, or were you funded?
No, nobody ever paid me a dime for anything.
Okay.
So that gets to the point. Carl said, well, you're a nice guy. Have a nice flight back to Denver. You're dead wrong about everything. Go home and enjoy your summer. So I was a little taken aback. He said that in the room to me, where all of these private investigators, and there were several lawyers in the room, and then he took me out to the elevator, grabbed my arm and said, get me some more information. So that's really where the story begins. And if you keep your eye on sort of those 4 pieces of information, you might hear something about the Simpson case you haven't heard before. It's interesting to watch all these shows they're doing on television where they trot out exactly the same people who say exactly the same thing, and the case never advances 1 inch. So hopefully, if there's any value in this, it's trying to advance it that 1 inch. So anyway, Carl and I went back and forth, and he said the main thing he said about the blood was that it was absolutely known, that Simpson came back from Chicago 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He goes down to the police station with no legal representation to talk to 2 investigators, 2 detectives. He has his blood drawn, with no resistance whatsoever. I might pause to ask you here, if you just sliced up a couple of people and left blood all over the place, and 12 hours later somebody wanted to take a sample of your blood, you might consider asking for an attorney. None of that ever happened. He simply handed over his blood. It went into the purple cap vial, and the first thing that Carl told me, and this was definitive, it's a nice theory, but as soon as blood is drawn, it is taken to where evidence is held in Los Angeles. It's called the Parker Center. It's checked into evidence, and that's the way the story goes. So it took a while to figure out that Detective Van Adder, who was one of the detectives questioning Simpson at that time, did not, in fact, enter that into evidence after drawing it. He put it in his pocket, and he left the station, and he drove around Los Angeles for several hours, and there was a criminalist who testified to this in the case, and so it's all a matter of public record. When that information became known, Carl started to take me a little bit more seriously, and he started to take my phone calls, and we started to talk. Then they got the book of evidence discovery that prosecutors have to provide for defense teams in criminal cases. Well, let's see, what was in the evidence book? There's a nice, shiny color picture of a broken piece of stick found outside by Simpson's Bronco. And there was a chain-link fence, if you think of the case, where Cato came and had a room back there in the back. There's a little walkway there where Fuhrman claims to have found this bloody glove. And there's a chain-link fence, and what's on the other side of the fence but a blue plastic evidence bag. So. Oh,
wait a second. There was an evidence bag lying behind Cato's.
On the other side of the fence, on the other side of the property.
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah. So there was one other piece of information that I left out, and I'm telling the story in this way. This is what I was told. Let's see how it checked out as things progress. I didn't say I agree with this, I believe it, or anything else. The other piece of information I was told was that what everybody knows kind of about the Simpson case is that at about 6 o'clock a.m., June 13th, 20 years ago this morning, 4 police officers drove over to Simpson's. Fuhrman sent the other guys into the house, and he goes out and claims to find the glove. That's a well-known story. What I was told was that Fuhrman and one other person made a prior trip over to Simpson's before that, around 3 a.m., with the absolute conviction that they would find something on O.J.'s property. They would find some evidence. They would clearly show that he was guilty, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I was told. If you recall the trial, I was also told that they didn't find anything over there, and they got into a big argument about it. If you recall the trial, there was a woman named Rosa Lopez who lived right adjacent to Simpson.
Okay.
And she testified in court without prompting or anything else that she heard an argument on the property at 3 a.m. in the morning. That's an important piece of information. So that's the fifth piece of information, which turned out to be testified to in court. So after about 6 weeks or so, I had Carl Douglas's attention, and he was starting to think that there was something to this. My purpose in dealing with them primarily was, to me, there was one provable thing in the case, and that was, is that substance in these blood samples? If that substance is in the blood samples, then it did not come out of his body on the night of the crime. It had to come from the vial. It was also testified to in court that I believe it was 8.5 milliliters were drawn of his blood, which is standard. But what was checked in to the Parker Center was something less than that. So all of the blood was not accounted for. Again, it's a matter of public record for anybody who's interested. So I kept saying to Carl, can you just get your hands on some of those blood swatches and test them and see if this is true or false? An incredibly complicated thing to try to do. And anyway, it's a long story. They went back and forth, but I dealt with Barry Scheck, who was the head DNA attorney there, who didn't know anything about EDTA. I dealt with Peter Neufeld, who was his assistant, and I dealt a lot with Carl Douglas. And things began to get more serious. This started in August, the first week of August of 1994. In mid-October 1994, I received a call from Douglas and Cochran. This is about 10 weeks later. The trial hasn't started. And they said, we have a proposition for you. And I said, what is that? And they said, if you will come to L.A. and if you will find out what was done with some of that missing blood in the crime lab, and if you will get that person to testify about this in court, we'll pay you something. I didn't think this would ever work. I didn't think I'd ever see a nickel, but it was too intriguing for an investigative journalist not to say, okay, I paid for the whole thing. I'm an independent journalist. And I went out there, and this stuff gets extremely complicated, but the gist
we're with
of it
you. We're following you.
What's that?
We're with you, man. And the chat room is all following everything you're saying. Everybody's with you.
Okay. So I knew who was the person that they wanted to talk to in the crime lab. And I made contact with her, and I tried to present this to her. She was totally and completely freaked out, and this didn't go anywhere in terms of my being able to do what they wanted me to do, and they never paid me any money and all of that. So there was a lot of conflict and tension that existed between them and any journalist, and certainly me. I mean, I was presenting them with something that nobody else had, and I was trying to determine the validity of all this. So I'm also a writer. I'm also a self-employed writer. So I took all the experience I'd had over the last 3 months, and I wrote up a 15 to 20 page recounting of it and introduced some of these elements into it. I mean, by now we knew that the stick was a part of the evidence. We knew the bag was part of the evidence. We would subsequently learn this thing about Fuhrman and Nicole. We knew that there was an argument on Simpson's property at 3 a.m. that morning. And so it looked like this source was turning out to be pretty good. So I wrote up some things that basically outline what I'm talking about, and I sent it to a publishing house in L.A., and I wrote across the top of it, strictly confidential, no one is to see this, except the publisher. Well, I was kind of surprised when he gave it to the L.A. District Attorney's Office.
Wow.
The L.A. District Attorney's Office gave it to Carl Douglas.
Wow.
And that was not good. So that, investigative journalism is a dicey game. People trust people for a while, and it's a very, very dicey enterprise. But there's a point to all this, and I'm getting to it. And it's critical to understand in the context of how little people actually know about this case. So by early November of 1994, what I wrote, there's actually a quote in Chris Darden's book. Maybe I should read that to you. It's very, very, very illuminating. And Chris Darden, as I think everybody knows, was the one of the leading prosecutors with Marcia Clark. So years later, Christopher Darden wrote a book called In Contempt about the case.
All right.
My book proposal got into his hands 3 months before the trial. And in his book, which came out years later, this is what he wrote. It's page 178. I was basically looking at a blueprint of O.J. Simpson's defense months before it became operational. Clearly the guy, that's me, had spent more than a brief moment with Cochran and Douglas. Singular was writing about information that hadn't been made public at the time he wrote his treatment. Later, as the defense team argued their impossible conspiracy theory and reporters wrote about the dream team as if it were the 1927 New York Yankees, I would wonder how much Simpson had paid for a defense that really came from a true crime writer. So that might give a little validity to what I'm saying.
Do you have that framed on your wall?
No, I don't, but I've got it right here in front of me. So,
oh, man, I would have that on my wall. Yeah.
So that created a huge rift with Carl Douglas. But the important point of this is that the prosecution then also knew what Simpson was going to present about the blood evidence. And the prosecutors were so totally and completely convinced that they were right and this could never have happened that the trial started in January of 95. In February of 95, this issue came up in court. And one of their DNA people said, this is so outrageous that we will call the FBI in. We will have the FBI test this blood, these blood swatches, and we will categorically disprove any of this could have ever happened. Now, this is public record. This is not something I'm making up. They did, in fact, call in the FBI. They did, in fact, test the blood swatches. And guess what happened? They never called the FBI agent as a witness, but the defense did. And the FBI agent testified May 1995, there is something in these swatches consistent with, that's the quote, consistent with EDTA. The defense called their own expert who had far more experience in this kind of thing than the FBI guy did, and he said, yeah, it's in there. So what everything I'm saying amounts to is this, that the prosecution insisted that there was a mountain of evidence against O.J. Simpson. The mountain of evidence consisted of two gloves or a glove that absolutely would not fit his hand. The whole world saw that. And blood evidence that was tainted with a chemical substance, which the world really doesn't know anything about. When Simpson was acquitted, as we all remember, in about 3 hours, which is absolutely incredible, the jurors came out and they talked about this blood evidence, and they talked about what was in the blood. They talked about a lot of other things, but they talked about that. Let me backtrack a little. It's hard to remember the whole story from 20 years ago, but
you're doing great.
In April of 95, after my book proposal surfaced, and a couple of people wrote about it, the L.A. Times wrote about it.
We got a break coming up. Wait, Mr. Singular, I apologize. We got a break coming up.
Okay.
We are with Stephen Singular. Fascinating information. The author of the book Legacy of Deception, an investigation of Mark Fuhrman and racism in the LAPD. Stephen, just so you know, when we have the break, because we didn't get a chance to talk before you came on, if we talk over the break, the audience will hear us. We want to keep mute until after the break. Incredible information, a story that has to come out. Well, I'm going to beg him to come back again, by the way. Stephen Singular, we'll be right back after this. Okay, welcome back to the Opperman Report. I'm private investigator Ed Opperman. We have with us tonight Stephen Singular, author of Legacy of Deception, an investigation of Mark Fuhrman and racism in the LAPD. This is some of the best O.J. Simpson information I've ever heard. The chat room is going nuts. You can find a link to his book on my blog, The Opperman Report. Stephen, we only have a half hour left, right? But what we do sometimes is we do an after show. We can drop the server one station, but we'll still be on CJ Mars Radio. We can go on as long as you want. Okay? If you can stay with us a little longer, that'd be great, man.
Let me see how much firepower I've got.
Okay, no, you're doing great. I'm going to beg you to come back no matter what, but go ahead.
If people are interested in this book or other books, the website is Stephen, and that's STEPHEN, singular, SINGULAR, So there's a lot of stuff there to look at as well. So to go back to where I was, we're in April of 1995. This is part of the way through the trial, maybe about halfway through. When the book proposal surfaced through the LA Times and some other outlets, I was contacted by 48 media outlets, everybody, New York Times, Chicago papers, LA, networks, radio, everything, 48, count them. That the information that was in the proposal and the information that I talked about with these people is this information. And this is very, very important. And it was saying, you can concede that the blood they're talking about is O.J.'s blood, but where did it come from, and what can we determine about that blood? So you have an FBI agent who's a blood expert testify that there's something consistent with this element in these samples, and you have the defense team do it much more strongly. In early May of 1995, Barry Scheck said, we have a bombshell coming on ADTA, and they did. So fast forward to October, and Simpson is acquitted on October 3rd. And part of the reason he's acquitted is because the blood evidence fell apart. How many people of those 48 media outlets do you think I was contacted by for a follow-up question on how this had played out in the trial?
Zero.
Try zero.
Yeah.
Okay, so I had been told at the very beginning of what the story I'm telling you that there was some connection between my first book about the neo-Nazi assassination of Alan Berg in Denver in 1984 and this case. How could that possibly be? What possible connection could there be? Well, as we learned, we had a virulently, violently racist cop commanding or talking about or theoretically collecting the key pieces of evidence in this case. I was told that the stick was used to pick up the glove. The glove was put in the bag. The bag was used to transport the glove over to Simpson's. The stick and the bag were subsequently discarded because they had to be. That's the connection of the stick and the blood, the stick in the bag. We know about the blood. When it became known what a virulently, violently racist person this police detective was, even the LAPD was disturbed enough to say, well, we better look into that. And they had an IA, an internal affairs report on Fuhrman that came out sometime later. And we had people come forward in the DA's office or the LAPD. We're talking about the prosecution side here, folks, saying they had heard these comments that Fuhrman had made. There was a report that he put a swastika inside the locker of a fellow police officer because the man was married to a woman who was Jewish. We heard all kinds of things. Is there a connection between what I first wrote about? And then there's one little other thing that's the kicker. And that is that when Alan Berg was killed by this group called the Order in the Northwest, these racist revolutionaries, they were, the murder weapon that killed Berg, a MAC-10 pistol, was found in the home of Gary Yarbrough, one of their group, in Sandpoint, Idaho.
Wow, okay.
When Fuhrman retired in disgrace from the LAPD, where do you think he moved?
Idaho.
Sandpoint, Idaho.
Wow.
Which was a known sort of retreat for certain LAPD personnel. So how did that play out in the course of this? And the Internal Affairs report also said that Fuhrman had bragged about seeing Nicole Simpson's breast implants. So that's the fifth piece of information. that their
Can I interrupt
relationship,
you?
and I'm not suggesting they had an intimate relationship.
Let me interrupt you for a second here, because I have some people calling in after the show that I know. I know them through Facebook, and they know Mark Fuhrman through Facebook. And according to them, Fuhrman said that to them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what I'm telling you is what I know this is from an internal affairs report.
Yeah.
Yeah. That the LA legal system conducted. So they had people coming forward themselves throughout this and saying, this guy's a problem. And, maybe we should pay attention to look at the evidence a little bit more closely than we have. But, of course, the prosecution team plowed forward, had O.J. try the glove on in front of the world. That was a disaster for them. Had this blood evidence presented in the trial, had Simpson acquitted in no time at all, and then turned around and said, it's the jury's fault. They just couldn't understand the scientific evidence. Whatever they said, whatever spin they put on it, and 20 years later, when they run their TV shows now, let's see, they're talking to Cato Kalin, they're talking to one of the Brown sister. Those are the people they're going to try and illuminate something about this case. The key thing to understand about the O.J. Simpson case, this key, central, absolutely important point is this. There was never a murder investigation done on this case, ever. Fuhrman took the three other guys, over to O.J.'s house at 6 a.m. We know this. He says he found the glove. We know this. The yellow tape goes up around the place, case closed. If they had taken 2 steps in any other direction, they would have found some very fascinating information about other people involved in this case. And that never happened. And that's the real story of the Simpson case. And until that investigation will probably never happen at this point. But in 1993, there was a young man who hung out in the Goldman circles named Brett Cantor, who had his throat slashed from ear to ear. In 1994, Ron Goldman met the same fate. In 1995, there was a young man from Colorado named Michael Nigg, who was also in the same circles, who ended up shot dead in the parking lot of the El Coyote in L.A. restaurant. If any homicide investigation had been done of any kind in this case past 6 a.m. on the morning of June 13th, 1994, it would have led in other directions. And that was never allowed to happen, and it has never happened today, and it may very well never happen. And the shame of this and the disgrace of this is that you had a jury sit from January until October and do their civic duty and absorb the evidence, and the only view that matters in a criminal case are the 12 jurors in the box. They're the ones that actually have to listen to the evidence. This case has racial elements in it, but it's not really about race, and as it's always presented as being. This case is about evidence. All criminal cases are about evidence. The evidence fell apart in front of the jury, and the jurors paid attention to it. And the mountain of evidence crumbled, and that's what happened. And until it's absolutely disgraceful that the jurors were treated the way they were treated and called the names they were called and were made to look bad in this situation. It's incredibly disturbing. They did their job, they paid attention, and they reached their verdict, and that's what they're supposed to do. And it's stunning how they had no difficulty seeing through this charade, but the rest of America apparently does. Can't do that. So anyway.
Amazing. Okay, who was your source in L.A. that was giving you this information?
Well, I've never talked about that, and I won't be specific. What I'm telling you is that there were people, and it was reinforced, which I didn't later on by the internal affairs investigation. I didn't know anything about that, until it happened and they produced their report and all of that. But there were people who came forward, or a few people early on, and said, this is not going to hold up. There is a toxic atmosphere around Mark Fuhrman. I mean, if you read the psychiatric reports that were done on the guy, they talk about.
Yeah, why don't you give us a little history of Mark Fuhrman?
Beating up minority people in the 77th Street Division in Los Angeles until their pants, the officers' pants, are covered with blood. This is the person, ladies and gentlemen, that they put on television after the case as some sort of hero. This is the person they turn to as an expert. This is the person hired by Fox. This is the person Oprah Winfrey brings on her show to exonerate. If you're not upset by this, I can't help you. It's absolutely known for a fact. This is what he talked about. This is on tape. This was in psychiatric reports. This was in everything else. This is the person America chose to embrace and to push the evidence as far aside as they possibly could. And 20 years later, nothing has ever advanced. And I hope people are at least willing to hear this with a somewhat open mind, because the Simpson case is about evidence. It's not about these other things.
Well, let me ask you this. How is it that Mark Fuhrman, does he have a press agent? How does he pull this off? Because even his book about the Skakel case, it all blew up now, and Skakel's getting a new trial. How is he pulling this off? How is he able to cover up his past and put on this even when convicted of perjury?
Well, I mean, I'm not the one supporting him.
I know.
Why on the face of the earth would the most powerful black woman in the United States of America, Oprah Winfrey, put this guy on television, unfiltered, to present, his side? Why wouldn't you bring in? I mean, Barry Scheck is an American hero. Barry Scheck did the DNA evidence in the Simpson case, and after it was over, he didn't seek publicity. He didn't go out and do what Fuhrman did. He and Peter Neufeld started an innocent project to go around to the prisons of the United States and use DNA evidence to try and get people off death row or get people out of prison who were wrongly convicted based on scientific evidence. That's the way the system's supposed to work. And, we went into a ditch here as a country. We drove the car into the ditch, and we had the opportunity to back up and to get out of the ditch and to learn something about it. And I speak to you as somebody who dealt with major media throughout this. The New York Times, all of these other papers. When the thing blew up in their face, I mean, they don't have what it takes to say, let's re-examine this. Let's look at this again. Let's see what actually might have happened here. That's what real journalism is. That's what investigative journalism is. They made up their minds and just like what happened in the trial.
Yeah, there was a storyboard that they had to go along with, and they're not willing to change it no matter what the facts are. But what is behind that, though?
What's behind it?
Yeah, ego?
What's behind it is, this is what I learned, okay? I mean, I grew up in the 60s and all of that, and, people were fairly rebellious, and they knew how to question authority, and they didn't just swallow whatever was put on their plate, and they had some ability to push back. What I learned watching this is that propaganda works. Incredibly intelligent, well-meaning people can't really resist it when it comes at them at that level. It doesn't. They can't do it. And that's the bigger point here. Whether you agree with me about Simpson or Fuhrman or anybody else, our society went sideways here because it's happened again and again and again with other major events where some instant mythology gets created. This is what happened, and you can't penetrate it with anything resembling factual information. The only thing I was interested in was the factual information. Is this stuff in the blood or not? If it's not, I'll go home. That's fine. I was just trying to find out what actually happened. And it played out in a way where it actually got tested and you actually got results. But no, I would be shocked if very many people listening to this program have ever heard any of this information. This is the critical information in the case. The prosecutor brought in the FBI, and it didn't go their way. And instead of pulling back and saying, well, what actually did happen with that blood in that vial when Van Natter was carrying it around in his pocket for 3.5 hours that afternoon? What actually happened in the crime lab where Henry Lee eventually testified, and he said what happened is that they created swatches in the crime lab that were supposed to have somebody's initials on them, but when they got to Pennsylvania where they do the DNA testing, those initials were not there. And they said, well, what does that mean? And Henry Lee had one of the most famous lines in the entire trial. Something wrong, he said. Something wrong. That what actually happened? I mean, when do we stop the projecting, the assuming, and the absolute lying and look at something and say, well, what's the actual truth here? I mean, what does this really mean? I grew up in the age of Watergate. I grew up in the age of, legwork, gut bucket, hard-working journalism where you're trying to actually figure out what happened and how the facts fit together. That has nothing to do with what happened here. The television put Simpson on, he's in his Bronco, he's driving down the road. What they don't tell you, is that 4 days earlier, he's sitting with two police officers and they say, hand over your blood, and he says, sure, stick the needle in my arm. Is that consciousness of guilt or is that consciousness of innocence?
Let me ask you a question, though. Why did Howard Weitzman let him go there alone, and why did Howard Weitzman drop him as a client?
I don't know why he dropped him as a client, but it never occurred to Simpson that he was a suspect.
Okay.
Nobody on earth would go through that circumstance if you just sliced people up and cut up your hands. I mean, it ain't going to happen. And it's just we've got to learn to think about these things. I mean, he goes down there. He's alone. I believe he poses a question to them about who got shot. He doesn't know what happened. And, this is factual information. Anybody who's really interested can find that out. And
let me ask you a question. You said that Mark Fuhrman went back to the house with another individual. Who's that other person?
That's what I was told. What I was told.
But you don't know who it was?
I'm not certain who it was. I have an idea who it was, but I'm not certain. But what I am certain of is that this woman testified that there was an argument on that property at 3 a.m. And it was heated. And so if you extrapolate out what I'm saying, it goes like this. You're at the crime scene. You talk somebody into going over to some other place because you know you're going to find something.
Right.
You go over there and you don't find it. There's a big argument, and you go back. Right? Now you talk 3 other officers into going with you over there. What do you think is going to happen this time? You think you're going to find something? I think you are. So that's my point. If you look at the information that I was given in early August of 1994, if we just go through the laundry list here in the last few minutes, is there a stick? Yes. Is there a bag? Yes. Did Fuhrman know this woman apparently beyond what we knew based on an IA report? Yes. Is there this substance in the blood based on this testing? Yes. So the only way I could have ever been involved in this as if there was validity in what I was told. I would have been blown out of the water in 10 seconds otherwise. The Shapiro hotline, when I started to get involved, was getting 800 calls an hour from people who thought they had information. 800 calls. So, if you didn't have something to say, they weren't going to listen to you. And so my thing here, the other point was, what is there a connection between the racism in the first book and the racism in this situation? Yes, there was, demonstrably.
Because your source in L.A. contacted you because of your book about Berg?
Because of the book about Berg. You have investigated these types of people before. Well, guess what? There's a pocket of these people operating inside the LAPD, believe it or not. They're people with these same beliefs operating. So when Fuhrman, when it's on tape or when it's in a psychiatric report that he's talking about beating up black people until they're bleeding all over his pants, gee, it sounds like a connection to me. That's exactly the kind of rhetoric that was used by the people who came to Denver in 1984 and killed Alan Berg. Exactly. What was their greatest fear on the planet? Of the people who killed Berg. That a black man would date a white woman or marry a white woman. What was Fuhrman's? If I see a black man going around L.A. with a white woman, I'll find something wrong. So,
can you get into
matchup?
Fuhrman's history as a cop? Because he was in traffic most of it. He's not a big investigator. He was in traffic most of his career.
Well, yeah, on this particular case, he wasn't in traffic.
Yeah.
It's happened to be the biggest criminal case in American history. I'm not disparaging police or the LAPD or anybody else. I have great admiration for police officers, men and women. But it would have been nice for the person running this thing, from the very moment it began, to have pulled back and conducted a real investigation into this case. I think they would have taken it in a very, very different direction.
Okay, Stephen, we got 1 minute left. Can you stay a little longer after we drop this station and do the after show? Maybe take some calls?
I really... Okay. I don't think I can do it right now.
Okay, can I beg you to come back another time?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, man. Stephen Singular, give us your website and your book and how people can reach you and all this kind of stuff. What do you want to say?
www.Stephen, again, it's STEPHEN, singular, SINGULAR.com, StephenSingular.com.
StephenSingular.com, an expert on the OJ case, an expert on Mark Fuhrman. Incredible book. You got to run out and get this book. The link is on my website, Opperman Report blog. Thank you, Stephen. Hey, don't forget, guys, I'm going to be on Caravan to Midnight on Monday with John B. Wells, talking about the Las Vegas Walmart shooter with all the governor candidate and all those guys with me and the sheriff candidate. And next week, we're doing a story about the Cotton Club murders and Roy Radin and Robert Evans and all those guys. I'll see you next week. Thank you.